Welcome to Pique Your Interest, your go-to podcast for all things mortgage and real estate. Hosted by Tanner Greenwald and Tim Malaskis. We bring you expert insights to help you buy, sell, and invest with confidence. Let's dive in.
Welcome back to the Pique Your Interest podcast, the podcast where we seek to demystify some of the more challenging and lesser known things about the home buying process and real estate in general. I am one of your hosts, Tim Malaskis. I'm a loan officer here at the Millersville branch.
I am Tanner Greenwald. I'm part of the Greenwald team of First Home Mortgage at our Millersville branch.
And today we are going to talk about appraisals. An appraisal is a necessary part of most of the mortgages that we originate. Now, there are times that you don't need an appraisal, and we'll probably touch on that later today. But for the most part, you need an appraisal. And, if you've never bought a house before, you're probably like, well, what the heck is an appraisal? Well, it's a good question. An appraisal is an appraiser's opinion of the value of your home. And so as a bank lending money, we want to make sure that we're lending money to you and you are buying a house that is worth what you're paying for it. And so we hire an appraisal. We have a roster of appraisers. We've vetted them. We've worked with them for a while. And it's a rotation basis. We don't actually get to pick who the appraiser on any specific file is. There's just a rotation. And whoever the next person up, gets that appraisal. And so, we order an appraisal. An appraiser, their job is to make sure, again, that the property is worth what you're paying for it. And they're looking, in a lot of cases, for the health, safety, and security of the person that's going to be occupying the residence. And so whether it's a purchase or a refinance, you need to get an appraisal for the most part. Again, sometimes you can get an appraisal waiver, but if you're not getting an appraisal waiver through the automated underwriting system and you need to get an appraisal, we're going to get an appraisal on a purchase to make sure the value's there. A lot of times when it comes to refinances, the value that the home has versus what is owed on the home, in other words, the equity, a lot of times determines, what kind of loan you want to do, what your interest rate's going to be, some of the terms of your loan. And so an appraisal helps us figure those things out. Now, there are different types of appraisals and different reasons that we would get them. And I will turn it over to Tanner to talk about that.
So you have your standard loan types. You've got FHA, conventional, USDA, VA, and obviously refinancing. But when you're talking about purchasing a home and you've got your different types of appraisals or different ways that appraisals are structured for the different loan types, that's something important to note on, especially for us as lenders.
Totally.
So, I'm just going to dive into one of the more aggressive ones, which is FHA. Because it is a government-backed loan, it is more strict, especially when it comes to appraisals. So today we even printed off an FHA property inspection checklist that an appraiser has to look at and go through to make sure all of these things look good, they're checked off before they give the go-ahead on the appraisal. And if it's not, then it's something that's a required repair before you are able to purchase your home.
Yep.
So here's just a couple of examples. Defective paint surfaces on exterior or outbuildings, cracked walls, cracked floor, evidence of destroying insects, wood rot, steps without handrails, doors without stairs or landings. And these are just, again, a couple of examples of how strict they are with the appraisal that's being done on FHA homes. When you're thinking of conventional homes, they're not as strict when an appraisal is done. I mean, there are checklists that they have to abide by when it is a conventional purchase and an appraisal is being done. But, it's definitely not as strict as FHA is. So sometimes people are like, well, why would I not go FHA versus conventional? And sometimes this is what I talk about. It's like, when you're getting an appraisal done, they're way more strict with an FHA appraisal than they are with conventional. Not knocking on FHA, but just had to mention that. And then we have VA. So VA is handled a little bit differently. When we have somebody purchasing a VA home, we order the appraisal through the VA portal that we have access to. And the VA appraiser has 10 business days to go out and get the appraisal done and get it back to us. That doesn't mean it's going to take 10 days. And I don't think I've ever had a situation where it took 10 days. But once that's done, wrapped up with, they get back to us and they give us the value and any repairs need to be made or anything like that. So different loan types have different rules and regulations about what they're looking for when an appraisal is done, what they're willing to accept, all that good stuff. So it's important to know the process of how the appraisal works. So we're going to let Tim talk about the process.
Thanks. So it's a pretty simple process, but I guess if you're on the outside looking in and you've never done anything like this before, you're kind of like, well, how does that happen? So the way that it works is we'll order the appraisal. I'm sure things work differently at different companies, but the way that things work here at First Home is, we turn a file over to our processors, and our processors, sort of set the file up. They do all of the ordering of third-party things, including the appraisal. So they'll order the appraisal. Part of that order is you want to purchase, sending in, the purchase contract to the system so that they can select an appraiser. On the purchase contract, there's contact information for the seller's real estate agent. A lot of times the appraiser will reach out to the seller's realtor, call and introduce themselves, schedule to set up the meeting. A lot of times real estate agents will come prepared. They'll have an actual sheet full of comparables. This is how I arrived at the price that, we listed the house at, trying to be helpful to the appraiser. So the appraiser will call and set up a meeting, go to the property, do their inspections, take measurements, certainly take pictures. And then the real work begins after that. They compile the report. They look at the comparable sales, similar square footage, similar size, similar build, construction quality, similar age. Recently, the more recent something is, the more valuable it is as a comparable. And so, the appraiser doesn't just take these measurements and pictures and, slaps it together and that's the appraisal. There's a lot of legwork that goes into it. There's a formal report that they have to fill out. There's a lot of information that goes into it, a lot of adjustments that are made, based on the differences between, our subject property and other properties that they're using to compare. So there's a lot of work that goes into it on the back end. I don't think a lot of people know what that is and how hard that is, but that's certainly something that appraisers are tasked with, and something that, when we get an appraisal back, our underwriters are looking for. How did they make this adjustment? Why did they make this adjustment? Why did they use this comparable as opposed to this other comparable? And so, part of the appraiser's job is to sort of preempt all of that and say, these are the best comparable sales I could use. These are the best adjustments that I can make. Here's why. And ultimately, here's what I think the value of the property is. And that's the piece that we are the most interested in, because that lets you know if the sales price that you have and the loan amount that you're using are things that you're going to be able to use. So the value on that appraisal goes an awful long way in a purchase transaction. And same thing with the refinance. You need to show that there's enough equity in the property for whatever loan product we're using. And so you get that appraisal report back to sort of verify that you're in good shape, or, you've got to make a couple of changes moving on. So the appraiser, makes all these adjustments for value, and value is important. And so, I guess the next logical question you would think of is, well, what sort of factors affect the value?
Well, Tim, when you're thinking about what affects the value, obviously where the location of the house is super important. So is it in a better location than some other maybe cities and counties that are surrounding you? What's the proximity to different schools in the area? A lot of people that have kids are super strict about where they want their kids to go to school and what that looks like. So I think that's important to take into consideration. And that's what appraisers take into consideration as well. Parks, shopping, if you've got any type of transportation around you, whether it's like a busing system or a train or whatever the case is. Obviously, if you're having a home appraised, the size of the home and the condition that the home is in is super important as well. So bigger homes are going to appraise for more. That's just kind of like the way that it is,
sense.
But the better condition that you keep your home in, and keeping things up to date in your home, that also affects the appraised value as well. And the appraiser will look at stuff like that. Like Tim mentioned earlier, comps. So comps are very important in an appraisal. So if you have, your home that's being valued right now by an appraiser, how many bedroom and bathrooms do you have in your home? What's your square footage? Do you have any upgrades that have been done recently? The appraiser is looking at everything that's been done to your house and what your house looks like, and they're comparing it to the different houses around you that have sold within the last 6 to 12 months within a certain, mileage range or whatever. And that's what they're comparing, your appraised value to. So that's another factor that influences the value. And then obviously your market trends. So how is the market doing? How is supply versus demand? We've shot a video before explaining the market trends and how to navigate them, but that also affects the different values that appraisers give when they're going out and appraising homes. So that kind of jumps us into, the next topic of what are some issues that happen on an appraisal or with appraisers or, anything along those lines. So why don't you tell us some issues that might arise?
Yeah. So I think the biggest problem would be, undervalue. So value comes in lower than what we thought. So it's lower than what we were estimating for a refinance or lower than the contract sales price in some cases for a purchase. And so, overcoming that is probably the biggest issue that we face. If an appraisal comes in low, we work at First Home Mortgage. I don't know how things work other places, but we have an appraisal review department here. So we receive an appraisal and, the first set of eyes on it is an appraisal review panel that we have. And there's these two guys in our corporate office that have a ton of experience with appraisals, and they look at the value, they look at the comparable sales, they look at all of the adjustments that are made, and they make sure that they think it's a pretty solid appraisal. If they have questions or anything they need addressed, they reach out to the appraiser. Sometimes you do get a lower value, and that's the way that it is. And you can ask the appraiser to, hey, did you consider these comparable sales instead? And the appraiser could look at it and say, yeah, I did consider those, and I don't think those are good comps, and here are why. Or, oh no, I didn't consider that. I'd like to take a look at it and maybe review what I've done. But fighting that appraised value sometimes is something that we find ourselves doing. The VA specifically has an entire department dedicated to that. And so the way that things work on a VA loan, it's kind of unique. It's actually kind of interesting, but there's something called the Tidewater Initiative. And when an appraiser conducting a VA appraisal knows in advance that they're going to have trouble with the value, bringing it in at the contract price, they'll reach out to the lender, they'll reach out to us or our processor, and they'll say, hey, I'm having a little bit of trouble with the value. Could you reach out to the real estate agents and get some comparable sales that maybe I'm not considering so that we can try to, substantiate the value? Mm-hmm. And so, real estate agents are happy to jump in and help out, supply comps. Sometimes the appraisal comes back just fine. Sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, then there can be potential problems because, a seller wants to sell a house for what they agreed to, and a buyer wants to buy the house, but nobody wants to buy a house for more than what they're spending. And, one of the things the VA has in place is to sort of protect veterans and make sure they're not overpaying for houses. And so there's an entire department at the VA that will review this for you. So if you've tried to work with the appraiser, tried to get them to change the value, adjust the value based on comparable sales, and, it's not working for whatever reason, you have the ability as, a veteran, you can reach out to the VA and say, I would like this value reconsidered. There's some paperwork that we do on our end. There's a letter that the veteran writes, but it all goes up to VA, and VA reviews and decides whether or not they think that, additional comp should be used, or, maybe when the adjustments were not correct or something like that. And so you'll get a decision rendered by the VA, which is pretty helpful. Something that's really interesting, that's really started taking, people have been taking notice of with all these changes lately is on conventional loans, there's something called an SSR. It's a submission summary report. And essentially what happens is we'll get a conventional appraisal back, and it gets run through sort of this software that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have, this algorithm they developed where they think that they have a pretty good idea what the value should be and what adjustments should be made and things along those lines. And so these conventional appraisals get run through this SSR, and you get a score 1 through 5. The lower the score, the better. But anything over 2.5 is usually a problem. And so you might get an appraisal back, and it might come in at the value that you want it. And there could be no repairs that are listed, and you're thinking, yes, I'm in great shape on this one. But the SSR has come back really high, and that means the appraiser needs to address something. And after every revision that the appraiser makes, you then run it through this SSR again to make sure that you're good. Eventually, you usually end up with something in the end, a good finished product with a good enough score and the value that you need and things like that. But every once in a while, you run into a situation where the SSRs are just way too high and the value just isn't substantiated, and then you need to make some changes. And so I've had conversations with real estate agents about it recently, and they're like, well, does FHA do the same thing? And, we've talked about FHA loans earlier and, why you may or may not want that. But FHA doesn't have SSRs. So if you get an appraisal that comes in at the value that you're looking for and the underwriter is okay with it, you don't have this other software telling you, oh, we think there could be a problem. And so, maybe there's some value in getting an FHA loan as opposed to a conventional in cases like that. And so I've had situations where we've had to flip to an FHA from a conventional because of the SSRs, and everything ended up just fine. So you can certainly overcome those obstacles, but it's not always the easiest thing to do, but it's something that's kind of new, and not a lot of people know about SSRs. So I think it's kind of important to touch on that as well.
Yeah, I agree.
And so, I guess, you start thinking, hey, I'm going to have an appraisal. What are some of the things that I should be doing to be prepared for that? And so why don't you give us a couple of things that we can do to get ready for it?
Yeah. So if you have scheduled an appraisal, I would just make sure, your house is clean. Everything is put away somewhere or hidden. I just think of those like closets where people shove all this stuff in the closet and it just falls out. But just, clean, declutter your home. Make sure that everything is working correctly, whether that's your HVAC or you've noticed a leak in the ceiling and you want to call a plumber to get it done, whatever. Just make sure your house looks presentable. Because that's very important. And again, make sure everything's fixed up. There's nothing like no cracks in the wall. If you've got an outlet that's got a little crack in it, depending on your loan type, they're going to knock you on it. So just, take a walk around, take note of everything. I like to take blue tape and I put a little piece of blue painter's tape on areas in the house that need fixing. And that's kind of that. And then obviously the timing of when you're going to have an appraiser come. So I would just like to say, if you schedule an appraiser to come out, you can reschedule it. It's not something that's set in stone. So if you notice that there's a huge monsoon rainstorm that's coming into the area on the day that you have your appraisal scheduled, maybe reschedule it. If it's a holiday time, decorate your front porch a little bit, decorate the house just a little bit, don't go overboard, but timing is kind of everything. So if you want your house to look good, make sure the weather is projected to look good as well. All of these things are really important factors. And if you're getting an appraisal done, and how to kind of help the value if you want, so.
Yeah, you're going to squeeze every penny you can. Right? Well, I think that is all that we have today. I think appraisals are kind of a thing that not a lot of people know about, and hopefully we shed some light on it for you. If there's any questions you have about appraisals or anything you think we could do for you, certainly feel free to reach out to Tanner or I. We're happy to help.
Yeah, sounds good. Have a great day.
Thanks for tuning in.
Bye.